So now we want to talk and zoom in on how do those factors of production actually get turned into output. Now this doesn't invalidate what we've talked about up to the present at all. Again, our big picture causal model is institutions determine the incentives to engage, right? Determine the incentives to invest in and use effectively the factors of production which yields output. In case you can't tell, I've already spent much of today recording some other lectures, so I'm running a little bit low on steam, but we'll try and get these out to you so that you can start looking through them. But what we want to do now isn't to change that model at all. Our big picture model, that is still our analytic framework, and that's where I anchor both pretty much all of micro actually now and macro. Now all we're going to do is going to zoom in on that link between factors of production and output and see if we can start thinking more rigorously as to how those factors of production get turned into output. So as we've talked about before, one of the big questions in economics here is why do some countries, now we're dealing with differential prosperity across space. We may or may not have some good ideas as to why growth started in the early 1800s in a sustained, prolonged fashion, but we definitely know that some countries are growing dramatically differently in the present. Now this, of course, was before the recent pandemic. Let's maybe zoom in here on, hopefully you know, that the piece on the right, hopefully you know the one on the left. I'm hoping you know that one. That would be the United States. And we have China over there on the right. And those actually are to scale, at least according to that map. So we have China and the United States. Now, this has changed and is changing. But for the last approximately 20 or 25 years, stated growth rates, official growth rates in GDP, and we can, again, there are some issues with these, just like there are some issues with Soviet GDP, although Chinese GDP is much better, and we can actually estimate it because they use a lot more prices. So Chinese GDP, let's say it's been growing at 10% for the last 30 years. Pretty impressive. Again, at 10%, how long would it take to double? The answer is 7 years. Now again, it's an approximation. So across, say, 30 years, how many doublings will we have seen? Across 30 years, at doubling every 7 years, we would have seen more than 4 doublings, a little bit more. So 100 to 200, 200 to 400, 400 to 800, and 800 to 1600. In other words, people in China, on average, at this point, would be 16 times better off than people were 30 years ago. And this actually is kind of interesting. You can actually see this. I probably won't go this summer. My guess is it won't happen again this summer, but last summer I was fortunate enough to be invited to teach in China for 2 weeks. And it was kind of interesting to see. You could tell a marked difference between people who were over the age of 60 and people who were under the age of 30. They clearly had been born into and existed in completely different worlds. So this is a big difference, this 10%. Now it has been slowing, but then the United States average over a similar time period of about 2.5%, 2.3%. Now, that's sort of the long-term growth rate in the United States. Which is better? Do you want to grow at 10% or 2.3%? Well, holding everything else constant, I would want to grow at 10%. But as we showed you, or as I tried to show you with the per capita GDP versus GDP figures, people in China are 16 times better off. Cool. That does not mean that they are better off than people in the United States, despite growing much more rapidly. There's a lot of ground to make up. But for our purposes here, we would want to at least be able to start thinking about 10% growth versus 2.3% growth. And for doing that, we can sort of split growth into 2 major categories. One's going to be catching up, and one category would be cutting edge growth. So if we think about this catching up growth, basically we need to imitate countries and people who have done stuff, right? Who have succeeded. And this, by the way, is most of the self-help books. If you want to figure out how to be a successful guitar player, you can follow the example of many people. Now, of course, you might need to have the genetics to do so. Doesn't matter how much I follow the example of LeBron James, I'm never going to play like LeBron James. I don't have the genetics for it. But countries, it's a little different here. So catching up growth is going to largely involve imitation. Cutting edge growth, however, is going to involve and require innovation. So let's think about catching up. This is not meant to be a definitive list, but this is a list of where we might start if we wanted to catch up. Point number 1, probably stop killing your own people. If you're slaughtering your own people, either directly by killing them through violence or by putting them in camps or etc., they're not going to have a lot of incentive to invest in physical capital or human capital or to use those things productively. So that would be a start. Another one, probably put in place property rights for all the reasons that we've talked about. Property rights and institutions are important if people are going to have incentives to invest in and use effectively the factors of production. Since I have China up here, again, I raised it, I think, in one of the videos, but that big drop in China in that Hans Rosling video was due to the Great Leap Forward, where we in effect got rid of property rights or got rid of private property rights particularly in agriculture, but in many other industries in China. And so what happened was people on communal farms, if you think about it, if they worked their butt off, if they got up early and they went out and worked their butt off, they basically, all of the produce from that farm was taken and divided up and redistributed, not among the people at the farm, but among all of the citizens in China. So if I worked my butt off and you worked your butt off, we weren't any better off. So why would you work harder? And basically people didn't. Now, it's far more complicated than that. If you're at all interested, there's a couple of really fascinating books on the topic that explain what happened. But in effect, that's what happened. We got rid of private property and people starved to death. We reinstate property rights and Chinese life expectancy goes up dramatically. So that was that blip there. So, and to a large extent, that's what Deng Xiaoping did subsequently after the Great Leap Forward, and sadly then the Cultural Revolution. But after Mao, Deng said, look, we'll go ahead and use markets. We don't care what color the cat is as long as it catches mice. So that's another option. Third big one, as I hopefully have foot stomped enough here, is if you open up to the outside world, you're going to have more trade, more international trade. You're going to be able to specialize more. You're going to be able to take advantage of a larger brain. So again, this isn't a definitive list, but this is a decent start. Now, if you think about how China has started growing, what happened? They, by and large, stopped killing their own people, some exceptions, reinstated property rights, as I mentioned under Deng, and did open up to the outside world. And guess what? They started growing. This, by the way, would help pretty much any country around the world. Of course, the tricky bit is it going to be incentive compatible for the rulers of a country to stop killing their own people and to reinstate property rights and to open up to the outside world? Oftentimes, in poor countries, they are poor because while it would be better for everybody in society as a group on average if we did these things, the rulers of these countries, very well, if they did these things, might end up getting taken out and shot. And so they would rather be alive and have a large share of a very small pie than be dead and have no share of a much larger pie. So we don't actually, currently where we are spending time as economists is trying to figure out how we can make it incentive compatible for rulers in poor countries and rulers in wealthy countries to do what is necessary for their country to grow. And that's not straightforward, but we do know the answer. We do know pretty well what people need to do. They need to put in place good institutions. The issue, of course, is that institutions are a phenomenon of human action, but not human design. They're like prices. They emerge from human action. And so it's difficult to plan these, and it's difficult to fully coordinate them. Doesn't mean that it's not important. But that's another case where we know the answer even if we don't know the story that goes with it. So now let's talk about cutting edge. Now again, countries probably have some mixture of cutting edge and catching up. That's true across the board. But this is conceptually, we can kind of separate these. So let's talk about cutting edge. How could we improve? How can we engage in cutting edge? Well, one thing we can do is find ways to mechanize human tasks. And the reason isn't because we don't want workers. The reason isn't because we want to put people out of work. The reason is because mechanization will free up labor to do more valuable things. If it wouldn't actually make sense to engage in mechanization. But you can think about many tasks that we've mechanized. I mean, again, I have mechanized the cleaning of my house to some extent. I have a robot vacuum cleaner that's running around the apartment. That frees me up to do other things. It also frees up my cleaning lady to not come as frequently. And when she does arrive and show up, it means that she may not have to work quite as hard, thus freeing her up to do things like wash the windows or who knows whatever else. Or just to have a more easy, enjoyable existence. So mechanization is an option. It's not the only one, but it is one of them. The other thing is we're probably going to have to come up with new products and new ways of doing things, new organizational structures even. This is going to be hard. This is going to be very hard. Cutting edge growth is a lot harder than catching up growth, at least once we get the institutions right. We know how to fix the institutions. We just may not know how to make it in people's interest to do so, or the exact ways in which we should do it. So it turns out, at least from my point of view, we shouldn't be too surprised that cutting edge growth is oftentimes slower than catching up growth. So again, the next thing here is to look at these factors of production. I'm going to take a break here, but maybe, and chop this up, but maybe take a moment before you open the next one and think about, what do you think the relationship between output and all of these factors of production is? What do you think that relationship is?